of 2010. Welcome, Stephen. Ian Southey Swartz is an LGBTIQ health and women's rights activist. He currently holds the position of program manager in the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, a foundation in the larger Open Society Foundations. And he is responsible for the LGBTIQ portfolio, focusing on the rights of sexual minorities in 11 Southern African countries. Welcome, Ian. So for this session, we're aiming to have a conversation-style discussion, which means that different speakers can choose questions that they want to respond to. And they would also jump in and respond to one another, rather than only questions that I pose. And because of translation, we want to be respectful of that, and including me, will try to speak slower in conflict. So in the last 30 years, there have been many accomplishments, and also there have been pushbacks to these accomplishments. There have been a surprising turn of events, both positive and negative, unexpected allies and champions on one hand, and a graying effect on allies when conditions have turned repressive fast. Each of you speaking today has been in the thick of it, navigating different domains, from front lines of struggles to behind the scenes. You have leveraged, and you continue to leverage, allies for LGBTIQ rights, while yourselves being allies to other movements. Strategically use your power and privilege while also being vulnerable. So I thought that maybe for this first question, it would be great to hear what does resistance and resilience mean for you, particularly in the context of a look back at LGBTIQ movements in the last 30 years. I leave that open to anyone who wants to. Yeah, Natasha.
Should I start?
Yes.
For me, this question is really important, and I would like to thank Chris for asking me this question, because for me, resilience and resistance go hand in hand. The definition of resilience is that inner strength that pushes us to keep moving forward in spite of an environment that is hostile, that is aggressive for LGBTI population. Without this resilience, without this inner strength, we don't have the necessary power to resist. Marsha Penn Johnson or Sylvia Rivera wouldn't have been able to resist. Without this resilience, the intersex movement wouldn't have had the strength to face, to create new leadership, and to fight against the system that keeps mutilating intersex bodies. Without this resilience, the LGBTI movement wouldn't have been able to legitimize homosexuality and recently transsexuality. To me, resilience is that strength that pushes us to keep resisting in all these different countries of the world. Without resilience, resistance wouldn't be possible.
I would like to add, please, Grace, if I really look back over 30 years, and 30 years ago, I wasn't an LGBTI activist. I wasn't even sure there was an LGBTI movement, to be very honest with you. But if I look back at 30 years, I need to remind the people in this meeting that we're talking about pre-internet, pre-mobile phone days. And activism looked very differently, right? I grew up in a country that was under South African occupation. information was tightly controlled. And even though the internet started in South Africa in 1991, it was limited to big business. We ordinary folk, it came much later for us. Mobile phones started in 1994. I think I got my first mobile phone in 1999. So we were always lagging behind. And then also remember back then, mobile phones was actually a phone. You could only use it for one thing, and that was to call someone. Short message services were introduced later. And so activism had absolutely changed. And I think you're talking about what does resilience and resistance mean?
Oh, no.
If I look at just where we started from pre all the technology days to where we are now, I see a lot of resilience because we have adapted and we've really used technology to our strength. 50 years ago, resistance only meant one thing, and that was showing up. You needed to decide whether you were going to be out. You needed to decide whether you were going to be on the street at that gay pride march that only had 40 people. So resistance meant showing up, and when ministers in your country would make really stupid remarks, such as there are only 5 queer people in my country, queer wasn't the word that was used, I'm using it, you had to be willing to be counted. And so resistance had come a very long way. Look at it today. We are a global community. We are connected in ways that we could never have imagined. We have seen so many of the things that we never thought possible happen. I am happily married. I grew up not ever believing in marriage. Things have changed and we have adapted. And I think that both resilience and resistance for us changed with the time. And so I do think that for everyone in this room, that might mean something slightly different depending on where you were, how things happened, etc. Just one last thing, how I learned about Stonewall. Somebody smuggled a book into my country. You couldn't find it in the library.
So that's a bit, yeah. So maybe we can go to looking at what are the highlights, at least maybe a greatest accomplishment of LGBTIQ movements over the last 30 years. I mean, that in itself will be a 2-hour conversation. But just looking at your own country, looking at your own region, if you could choose one greatest accomplishment in the last 30 years, what would that be? Stephen?
I think it's very easy when we start to think about the last 30 years to sort of focus on one story. But one of the most important things that has happened, I see it, is we have seen this huge realization by, I suppose, the lesbian, gay, transgender, intersex communities, the liberal left, the people who are generally political and welcome change, that we have to be together in the battle. And certainly from my point of view here in the UK, from having started campaigning 45 years ago now, what's really made a difference is that we now have a community of people who know where the future should be. We have constant fightbacks, we're always struggling. But and certainly as a trans person, as a trans person in 1975, I was meant to be completely invisible. I was considered, to have a mental health problem. I was lucky not to be hospitalized by one of the doctors I saw. I don't see that now. I see people actually, I went to Trans Pride March this year and there were, 3,000-4,000 trans people, plus their partners, plus their families, plus their brother-in-laws, in my case, out on the street, marching together with a real sense that we have an entitlement to be there. That entitlement has come because, I think, many years ago, when, as Ian points out, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have mobile phones, and certainly when I was trying to find other trans people, when I knew 3, I thought I'd hit everybody in the country. But the fact is, we created a form of family, a form of political family, a form of committed family. I have a small family that surrounds me, that I live with, that without whose support, I don't think I would have ever survived what we've been through. But it's also that bigger family.
Thank you, Stephen. Does anybody else want to attempt that question? Natasha?
I think Jan and Stephen already mentioned aspects such as the visibilization, the growth of the LGBTIQ movement, and this have allowed big accomplishments for our communities all around the world. The fact that the mobilization has brought us closer, you mentioned it a moment ago, for access to information. We thought that we were the only gay, lesbian, transsexual people in the world.
There's a bit of a problem with the audio
to our communities. So that was very difficult. 30 years ago, it wasn't unthinkable.
I'm sorry.
Around the world.
I'm sorry.
About the countries.
Sorry, Natasha. I'm sorry. We're having some problems with the English. The audio is very choppy. It's difficult to hear and understand. Is there a way to fix that?
¿Hay alguna manera de arreglar eso? Okay.
Thank you. Please, Natasha.
As I was saying, 30 years ago, it was unthinkable for our communities. We felt alone, completely alone in our country. To know that around 30 countries by now already have the right to marry with same-sex partner. It was impossible before to know that trans people could access to their gender identity on their official documents. 30 years ago, it was impossible to think that we were going to have a special rapporteur in LGBT subjects at the UN, and that the inter-American system, the international system, was going to compile reports on our things. That was unthinkable 30 years ago. That speaks loud and clear about resistance, and above all, about the courage and the strength that the LGBTI plus movement has achieved. And of course, we still have a long way to go, but we have made progress, and quite a bit, in the past 30 years.
Thank you. So the next question, I guess, is, while celebrating progress and celebrating achievements, we also need to look at the lessons learned. Look at what is the definition of progress. What are the lessons learned about the leadership that brought about change? And who was empowered? Who benefited most from these achievements? Who did not benefit as much? And maybe in a way to look at, some of the values and principles that are needed to achieve some of the things that were achieved in the last 30 years. What were some of the compromises, for example, that the LGBTIQ movement had, and where were the compromises made, and what were the impacts of that? Does somebody want to take up that question? It's a reflection, but it's a kind of an honest assessment of what achievement, what progress has meant.
Well, if I can jump in, it's a big question. There's a lot to say, but I think one of the things that's really clear is that, to me at least, that change really happens at local levels, and many of us work in the global space, and our solidarity is super important to build this community that we're seeing today, to share resources and access to tools. But the real heroes and sheroes of our movement are the folks who take risk at the local levels in their own countries, and risk pushing the status quo to make change. And sometimes that means pushing within your own movement, and within your own community, which is another, I think, really important lesson from at least my 30 years in this space, is that we really need to celebrate the political diversity of our movements rather than fighting one another. It's important to have, there are many theories of change, if you will. There are many different ways that we need to be making change at the same time, and we all don't have to agree. In fact, it's good to disagree, and to explore different ways of working. Some may want to risk a more ambitious strategy, and not everyone has to be on board with that. Some might be really comfortable with incremental change, while others are more comfortable pushing for bigger systemic change, and we kind of need it all at the same time. Another big lesson for me is that leaders need. You asked a question about about what leadership qualities. Leaders need to be comfortable with both having power and also wanting power. We can't be too comfortable in a victim status, or in only pointing out what's wrong. Where many of us are very good at making our needs statements with all the ways that we're persecuted and the ways that things are wrong, but you have to have solutions. And you have to bring people along with those solutions. Leadership requires listening hard to lots of people, and bringing your community along. And then the last thing, which is related to that, is that we've got to all get better and better at holding multiple visions at the same time. And you can, and without getting so dogmatic that you can't take a move forward. We can want to bring down capitalism, and we can still fight to access HIV medications, for example. We can want to get rid of the binary altogether and still fight for legal gender recognition. We need to hold anti-colonial and anti-racist analyses and feminist analyses and still make, incremental bits of change that aren't perfect and don't get us perfection, but get us partway. Anyway, those are a few of my lessons.
So let's come where the last thing you said, Julie. I like this idea. It's great advice, because sometimes I forget it myself, that we can hold multiple visions and we can push at the same time. But that also leads to compromise. And an activist friend of mine said that compromise may strengthen our resilience, but compromise means that our resistance loses integrity. What does somebody have? Okay, I see Ian, you're shaking your head. Do you want to respond to that?
I do not agree that compromise really lessens our integrity. As a queer movement, and especially as different bits of across the globe have sort of come together into this big global thing that we now have, this big, wonderful global community that we are, it was natural that we were going to come with different opinions, different ideas, different ideologies, and it was going to become a melting pot of a beautiful mess, right? And those of us that were in a good enough position were willing to say, wow, I was wrong about this for quite a long time. I'm willing to change my position. Or if anything, I more believe in the position that I had before. But we did make some compromises. We made some very serious compromises. In the beginning, when the trans movement was really beginning to take shape, I know that in Southern Africa, we chose to put the movement back into the closet because we didn't have the numbers. We wanted to have a unified message. And the compromise was we push agenda A today so that we jointly push agenda B tomorrow. And that is why I think the trans community made a huge sacrifice. But look at Southern Africa today. There isn't a single country without a vibrant young trans organization that is tapped into this global community. And so I don't believe that we mess up our integrity. If anything, we're strengthening it by acknowledging that we have these different views and opinions, and they all have to coexist.
Stephen, I remember when you and I talked, said something, you said, I'm a lawyer, not a philosopher. So compromise is part of strategy. And I thought, oh, okay. Do you want to say something?
I've always thought it's a really nice thing to be a lawyer because I never, ever have to think about etiology or what surgical procedures people have undergone or any of those matters. I simply think about the fact that this is a human being who is entitled to right. I would say into this conversation that though that is in some ways it's a great position to be thinking in terms of strategy, I do acknowledge that the enemy does not disappear. We have to be as quick on our feet as they are. We have, particularly here in the UK and in the US, in the last 2 years with the anti-trans movement that has moved out of the churches into this sort of gender-critical feminist movement. And ultimately, when you actually assess what they are saying, they are speaking from the same hymn book. Whereas I think, fortunately, we've always welcomed many hymn books into this church, but we have to be quick, we have to move, we have to always be strategic.
If I could just jump in, I think sometimes when we compromised or been or haven't won or we've lost a particular battle, we don't realize what movement forward might have actually occurred in that moment, and it's hard to.
Julie's frozen.
Julie is frozen, so while Julie unfreezes, I think she was talking about losing it forward, right? Julie, sorry, you froze. Are you back?
You froze for a bit.
Yeah, okay, I'm back. I'm sorry. It's my bad technology, and despite 30 years of progress. I was going to say that, we've been doing a lot of reflection on Beijing plus 25 recently, and I remember flying home from that event and saying, okay, well, we didn't get sexual orientation into the platform for action, but we actually, as a collective, managed to move what continues to this day to be fairly progressive language on sexual rights and reproductive rights and health. And at the time, I left saying, okay, next World Conference on Women, we're all coming back and working on sex worker rights, because whatever the left pole was going to be was going to help make everything else seem more palatable to the powers that be. And we lesbian rights activists actually helped move other, adjacent, pieces of progressive language. And so, but I don't think we always know. So we're actually moving forward, even when we lose.
So at this point, I guess, moving forward, moving back, one step forward, or 5 steps forward, half a step back, whatever the formula is, it's a good point, I guess, after 30 years to talk about the opposition. I wasn't in the movement 30 years ago, but the opposition to women's rights, to bodily autonomy, integrity, the people of color rights, the respect and dignity and entitlements, the opposition has changed so much on some level. So you may or may not agree with me that the opposition has changed, but I'm interested to know, what is the face of opposition? How has it changed? Is it just their tactics that have changed, or has the face of opposition changed? And how
I believe,
yeah,
I believe that what has happened is what has changed are the tactics. But basically, we have the same opposition that we have suffered for 30 years, but tactics have changed. Faces have changed. But basically, it's the same villain that keeps on opposing to the guarantee of right. The opposition that we had 30 years ago basically has diversified and now has more tools, more resources in order to give more opposition.
Anybody else?
I do think the opposition looks, what to me, it feels like the opposition still has all the old tricks that they had 30 years and 20 years ago, and they've acquired a whole new toolkit. I think what sometimes let me have sleepless nights is the fact that they outspend us, they out-organize us. I think that the opposition today, at least to me, feels much more insidious than it did in the past, right? And so we still find your religious leaders, your MP, who will say, gay and lesbian rights are not part of the African rights, etc. And that was the songbook from a long time ago. But we also find enhanced criminalization in places like Nigeria, suggestions of enhanced criminalization in places like Uganda. We do find that movements have, for strategic reasons, have come together, right? So the anti-gender ideology movement, which is really becoming so huge, making its way across the world, the new Pentecostal movement that we find, all of a sudden, all of these entities are marching in sync. And I think where I feel we haven't quite made the connection is that when you look at women's organizations, feminist organizations, organizations for people with disability, health rights, we haven't come together in the same way that our enemies have. And I don't have the answer to that because I've been trying to push it for the last 11 years that I've been with the Open Society, and it hasn't happened. But yeah, I do think that strategic coming together is something that we mustn't give up on, because when it does work, like in a little country called Zambia, where the women's movement finally decided to embrace some of the LGBTI issues, you can stop something small or big, depending on how you look at it, like violence. We can agree on one tiny thing. We're not going to ask for gay marriage. We're not going to ask to whatever it is you think we're asking for. We're just asking you to stop the violence that we as queer people are experiencing. Can we agree on that? And when you have that together, when those minds come together, so maybe that's also another compromise, right? We were talking about compromises before, where you are willing to compromise to get a certain outcome.
I push back a little bit about, have we been out-organized? We definitely are outspent. I mean, the opposition clearly has more resources, but have we been out organized? I don't know. I don't think so.
I think it depends on where you're talking about, right? I do think in some places we have been out organized. And I do think there, what we need to do, and again, this is a big room with people from all over the globe, how do we use our solidarity to help in places where people are being out organized by the enemy? Because the enemy isn't always that far away from us. It can be in our very families, our very people that should be our friends.
Yeah. Julie, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was going to lift up, I think some places we out-organize them. I mean, we have to really remember and learn from those incredible lessons like we're seeing in Argentina right, today with...
Yeah, Natasha, jump in, please.
The thing is that, as Julie is saying, yes, we get more organized in some sectors, but something that we have had, which is a gap that we have had as an LGBTI, is that we just put out fires. And we need a specific site. And once we achieve it, we believe that we're in a comfort zone. We enter a comfort zone and we leave it as that for some time. The opposition is relentless, doesn't stop, doesn't give you a break that you need. That sometimes when we achieve a right, or go for a right, and just to give you an example, we think that we conquer the world. We don't give continuity to that fight. Sometimes we believe that we win that specific fight, but we don't give continuity to it. And that's something that we need to work within the LGBTI plus movements. Something that the opposition does. The opposition keeps on going relentlessly. And that's something that really we need to overcome. But somehow we need to learn from the opposition in order to do our work better.
Grace, one more comment, please. The opposition comes from a very powerful position, and that is the position of fear. Yeah. And they have an incredible ability to talk in little chunks that people can absorb, and they speak in logos, right? What they say can go on a bumper sticker. We are trying to make substantive arguments. We're trying to explain why gay rights, why disability rights, why these are human rights. That's never going to stick onto a bumper. And so one of the things that I wonder is how we are going to get in this modern world where we talk and where we use TikTok and Snapchat and all of that. How are we going to change our messages to reach that community? Because I don't think it's a community that could be left behind.
There's several comments in the chat where people say, we may not be out organized, but we are out strategized. What's our strategy? The opposition is driven by hate and by fear. And so they are more unified. But we, for our integrity and for our the purposes of the way we do organizing, we talk about intersectionality. We talk about bringing different people to the table. We say it's not enough to just bring people to the table, but who is there and what is being said. The opposition doesn't care about all of those things. They are just driven in a single way. But we are right. I mean, we are the good people. How do we fight the opposition? Say that boldly. How do we fight the opposition that way? Stephen?
I think what's really important is for us older people to realise that there is a new generation coming in front. I so see this so much in the UK, having 4 young adults now in our lives, reaching, in one case, very senior position in central government, another one working in industry, 2 others in the public sector, but also all their friends from school who have met me, met my friends, have realised that there's a political campaign, have come out at Mardi Gras and Pride to march with us. This generation sees the world so differently from those people who are frightened of us. Because they know we're not frightening. Their colleagues, their peers, their friends. I'm just astonished at the wide friendships that my children have as opposed to what I had as a teenager and a young adult. And they are so open and so accepting, except for the people who are intolerant. But even then, they will work to change that intolerance. They're determined to be committed to the cause of change. So I think one of the very important things that we, as activists, must remember is that often when I look at LGBT young people, they can be very powerful when we're together, but as individuals, they can feel quite defeated at times by the sheer pressure. But if you can make sure that they realise that they have a whole community of young people on their side, it gives them so much support within schools, within colleges, within universities. And certainly, I mean, I teach at a university which has over 50% of our students are from British Muslim families. And I have seen the changes in those students over the last 30 years. And from a time when people would say, I'm not going to be taught by him, I now have, I can't think of a student who would dream of saying anything like that. They fight every inch of the way. So we have to look at that generation and recognise their power and what they can do.
Julie, you were cut off. I think you got bounced off.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. Did you want to pick up something? Opposition?
Earlier I was just wanting to lift up the successes when we do out-organize and need to really learn from them. I don't think the opposition, their tactics have changed. As Geeta said in the earlier session, their playbook has changed. They're co-opting rights language, but they're still primarily religious, intolerant extremism that has been our primary opposition for our entire movement. And they almost always, geography aside, play on the fear of harming children. There's some variation on that theme, whether it's anti-gender ideology and trans bathrooms or curriculum or comprehensive sexual education. It's almost always fear of hurting children. And we have found where we have succeeded, we have done deep work on finding messages, the right messages, not the ones that we activists think are the right messages, but things that resonate with average people. Yeah. And I think we have to do a lot more of that work. The other thing I just as a addition, I think the other primary opposition that we have is our own internalized homophobia, our own internalized sexism, our own internalized racism and transphobia, interphobia, self-doubt, and that is, one place that we actually have some control and can do the kind of deep, important personal work that helps us to become better activists and better fighters.
But the world doesn't look the same everywhere, right, Grace? Stephen and I agree. And right now, I am sitting here in South Africa in a wonderful bubble where all the youth will embrace me and think I'm incredibly cool. And I appreciate that very much. But the truth is, last year, 2019, the University of Namibia, where it's a dynamic tertiary institution, lots of young people had a survey, and 68% of the students on that campus said they would not want to live next to a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, or queer person, right? And the next question is, so if you do find out, what would you do? You know, if you found out that your neighbor was queer, an incredible 45% said kill them. And I think to myself, what the hell? How is it that 2019, how is it that in 2019 we are still having these discussions? And so yes, we have wonderful successes. My question is always, how do we replicate it? We need to keep in mind things like religion. It's impossible to get away from religion, culture, tradition, language. There's so many things that color our world, right? And that kind of influence how we see it.
But I would say to that, Ian, that actually the fact that we are now present in these people's lives. I mean, if you'd asked when I started teaching 30 years ago, and I used to ask my students in each year, half of them would say, gay and lesbian people should be put to death. It's the very presence of us, the very fact that we are there dealing with their ordinary lives as well as answering their more complex questions about our lives that makes the change. And when I see now LGBT teachers in school being out, and in universities, and I think that every single one of them, their voice makes that change. And I think that's a huge achievement.
So have we achieved genuine change? Of course, the word genuine is in inverted commas, italics, lowercase. Have we achieved genuine change? And what is genuine change? And I actually want to quote something from someone I read a lot and loved a lot, Audre Lorde, who self-identified as a Black lesbian mother, poet, author. And in 1979, Audre Lorde said, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those people who still define the master's house as their only source of support." Now, she made this comment in the context of challenging the women's movement, the predominantly white women's movement, and challenging white supremacy. But I think this quote applies, and it's something that I constantly ask myself in almost all of the work that I do. And so I ask you all this question. In fighting the opposition, in trying to get the wins we need, trying to work within the system, do we produce genuine change? And what is the master's house? How do you define the master's house?
If you allow me, may I?
Yes, please, Natasha.
If you allow me, sometimes we believe that the face of the opposition is religious, and sometimes the opponent is much bigger than that. It has to do with a binary system, with the heteronormative system that pigeonhole us and pushes us to the periphery. And once you are in the periphery, they do violence on us. They try to marginalize us and ostracize us and remove all rights from us. And one of the ways in which this master's house, this opposition tries to take away the rights from us, it's very cruel. It's in a cruel way, beyond many other things, because he minimizes us, to belittling us, and that has to do with the cost of that discrimination. How there is always a negative message against our population. And this negative message trickles down in some sectors of our populations. And that's why this cost is so high. And that's why a large part of the population, the trans population, in many Central American countries is only 28 years old. And there's a high rate of suicide because this method that it's still harping on us, telling us that we're sinners, we're sick, we're criminals, still trickles down inside of everybody. And that's why this homo, lesbian, transphobia that Julie was mentioning, that's internalized, penetrates inside our movement. That's why the tools sometimes, in order to fight or to dismantle this master's house, are so difficult to find because the system is so strong. They teach us since we are boys and girls in this system, no matter if you are gays, lesbians, or trans, it's very difficult for us all to get out from this system. That's why the changes in order to dismantle the master's house need to be structural. They need to go beyond the fight that we're living right now. It has to do with the education, how they empower us, how they teach us what our worth is since we're boys and girls, how they teach us that inner power that we have. This is something that they don't teach us because they always tell us that we are the bad thing, that we are the dirty ones, that we're the sinners. And as more LGBTIQ people feel more powerful, our movement will grow with better tools to fight this harmful cause. And one of the ways in which, from my organization, I have practiced is thanks to a dialogue. Sometimes we think that we don't need to dialogue with our enemy. However, I'll tell you a story, an anecdote. Very quickly. One of the biggest opponents that we had in our trans movement was the trans movement itself, that didn't allow for trans women to join the feminist movement because they kept telling us that we were men disguised as women, that we needed to join the feminist ranks in order to harm the women that belong to the feminist movement. And that's how with the PLENARY, we start setting up some dialogues to which we were building ourselves, and we saw that there weren't many differences. The both movements, the trans movement and the feminist movement, were seeking a true equality of rights. And that's how we started opening up with the feminist movement for the trans movement to join the movement. And the feminist movement wasn't only one. There could be many feminist movements with many faces. There wasn't only one single party for the feminist movement. That's why I'm telling you that to me, the power of dialogue is amazing, it's wonderful. There could be many other ways, but to me, it's one of the things that have really helped me.
And did anybody else want to take that up? Well, oh yeah, Stephen.
This is one of the most difficult questions for me. I've worked on the inside, finding a way in and working within the political systems, the courts, the framework that other people understand as being important in life. But actually, as an activist, I don't believe in their systems. And it's always that sort of personal compromise of doing things that I do not value. You know, making sure you wear the right suit and tie, that you speak in the right way, that you address the right people. But actually, we have to do both. Our enemy is that structure which is so determined to protect its own and not to change, and trying to explain really that, you know, every single human being in this world is entitled to be loved, to love, to create family, to, you know, participate as full citizens, and is sort of something that we have to constantly repeat to them, but in order to do that, we have to compromise to do it. And it's a sort of difficult balance between, your personal want to push against that and having to, my wife and I always used to say we had to appear the most well-behaved family in the land in order to get heard. We could never have an affair. So, there is always those sets of compromises. But we can still gradually remove the bricks from the wall.
You know what, Grace? This is such a heavy quote, honestly. And I do think that if we as the queer community think that it is an us and them, then that's a false dichotomy. The truth is we are masters too. We too prop up the very systems, the very tools that Audre Lorde is talking about. Sexism, racism, every ism you can possibly think of, right? Transphobia, homophobia. We too are responsible using some of those tools in our day-to-day lives. And I think we need to be very aware of how we use it and how we can dismantle it. I think that if you don't give thought to it, if you're not sort of actively thinking about it, it can escape you. But I do think we have, we're not passive sitting on the outside. We're definitely on the inside, right? And we have an outcome in what the Master's House is going to look like. You and I, when we had our one-on-one, I said to you, I have a great discomfort with, for instance, the tool that is called capitalism. And your question to me was, but you are a donor. How could you have a problem with capitalism? And I said to you, but capitalism does not serve 99% of the people that I am meant to serve. And so there are going to be lots of conflicts. There are going to be lots of things that we need to figure out as we go along. But the truth is that we must be very careful that we don't use those tools ourselves. And we can dismantle this house from the inside out. That's what I think.
So we have a few more minutes left, and I'd like kind of sum up some of the points that we have, that you all have raised, and then go to the last question, give you a chance to think about this. And the last question for the plenary would be, what would be for you 2 meaningful milestones for LGBTIQ movements for the next decade? If next decade is too far, then the next 5 years, but for the next decade. So if you could think about that for a moment while I just go over some of the points that you all have raised. So what I heard was the movement that both resilience and resistance has been the ability to adapt. And I think you all each said that in different ways, that adapting and being able to adapt is critical. Solidarity, being together, visibility has been a huge achievement over the last 30 years. And sometimes I feel a bit frustrated when we say we are now more visible than we were ever before, because the bar feels so low when we talk about visibility. But it's a tremendous thing. I mean, it is really a very high bar on some level. Somebody also said that there's a greater sense of entitlement now to our rights, which is a wonderful thing. And I think that is something that Julie mentioned this in one of your last comments. How do we overcome some of the internalized stuff? This is something that is done with so many movements in different parts of the world about feeling entitled to your rights, not knowing it, but feeling entitled. And that's where we become dangerous to the opposition, because they want us all to be, quiet and in our places and so on. Also, Natasha mentioned that one of the greatest achievements is we are not isolated like we were before, and that people can access certain rights. For instance, trans people can access ID. So that is a huge achievement. Lessons learned from what I see is that we have to celebrate our political diversity and not fight so much with each other. Fighting is not a bad thing, I think. It clarifies us and it holds our own feet to the fire, but fighting can also be so divisive. And we need to be comfortable having and wanting power and not just having the narrative of being victims. And I like the notion that Ian said of a beautiful mess, and that we should embrace the beautiful mess, and that through the beautiful mess, we are also extremely strategic. Stephen said, the enemy does not disappear. No matter what we do, we win. The enemy does not disappear. And that the opposition has diversified and that they have new toolkit, as Ian said, and we also have to diversify. So those are some of the points that I got out of our discussion so far. Did you want to add anything? Have I missed, that stood out for you in the discussion? Anything that you want to highlight? Or should I just go to the last question about milestones?
Yes, perhaps if you let me, regarding the last question, something that we need to think on. I mean, we can think of thousands and thousands of new gains for the next 10 years, new legislations, new laws. For instance, in the countries where still homosexuality is criminalized, that will never happen again. That all countries can have the same rights for the LGBTI plus population. But sometimes legislations are not enough, and the countries that have had those achievements in legislations have proven that, like marriage, etc., etc. If we don't perform changes, not only at legislation level, but also social and cultural changes, structural changes, then the changes in legislation will not serve us at all. If we don't make a change in the paradigm, a change in ideology managed by the population regarding our own population, but we still think that the LGBTIQ plus are the bad thing, that they're the sin, that they're illegal, so on and so forth, then there's still going to be murders and violence against our populations. We need to generate awareness since childhood about diversity and about our population. We need to generate awareness in our populations, in our countries, and talk more about intersectionality, about the LGBTIQ plus population, and indigenous population, population with disabilities. If we do not generate these social and cultural changes, then the new legislations will not help us at all. And another change that would be a good thing for the next 10 years is to start planting a seed since childhood and youth for LGBTIQ plus. This seed of strengthening, of empowerment, that they can really believe that they can achieve great things, because these older leaders can just pass on the baton to young people, so that we can share this wisdom with younger leaders, so that this new generation that has more energy is the generation that will make these achievements in the next 10 years.
Okay. So there's 3 minutes left. Yeah, Stephen.
I think all communities who are campaigning for change in the ways that we do face a problem of fractionalization within the media, particularly. the fact is young people, particularly from our communities, often don't have access to laptops or desktops or computers. They're working off a mobile phone, often with a cracked screen, with a poor internet connection. We have to find ways of using the tools that they use to tell a story of solidarity. Tell a story of solidarity about our community, to not have it dissipated, so that we can actually start to see the sort of movements across Africa and South Asia that Europe and the United States and North America see. A sense that we're not alone, but within our wider continental spaces, we are unified, and we can be unified. And that, I think, is the thing that would, if I want to see something 10 years from now, what I want to see is an African voice, powerful and strong, a South Asian voice that's powerful and strong in not just our conversations, but in the conversations in the courts, in the conversations in the governance, houses of government, and also in those conversations that take place at the super, over and above UN level and other major organisations. And I think those voices are still quiet.
I want to end my bit with how I start every day. Sorry, Julia, you're going to go first?
No, go ahead, Ian.
So every morning I get up and I say to myself, this very wonderful, complex, queer community, are a resilient people. And that is kind of what I need to say to myself to get through another day. And at the end of the day, what I do ask myself is, how much have we gained? And sometimes it's an inch and sometimes it's a mile. But I've not ever gotten to the point where I felt it was ever a total loss. And I think that drives us forward, right? Julie, you were talking about losing it forward. I am great at losing it forward. We might lose a court case, but we've started a national debate. And that is how I think we're going to change the world. And Stephen, you're absolutely right. Visibility, visibility, visibility. There's just no end to visibility.
Okay. Julie, you have the last word.
I guess so. Well, I think I took your question perhaps maybe a little too literally about meaningful milestones in the next 10 years, but one of them I think is happening in front of our eyes right now, which is genuinely integrating our struggles in bigger popular democratic movements. And this last year in particular, I just really want to lift up the ways that LGBT and sometimes intersex issues have been integrated into the revolutions of Sudan, Lebanon, Chile, right now in Thailand. These popular uprisings, sometimes revolutions, sometimes just popular revolts, have had platforms that have been truly, intersectional and have very publicly and deeply integrated our movements, and that is thrilling to see, and true progress. And I imagine we will see even more variations on that theme. And to me, those are huge milestones for our movement. And then the second one, I don't know how to actually quantify, but it has something to do with the evolution of how we think of gender. We are clearly mid-evolution. So we, especially our generation, can't actually see where we're going. Like Stephen, I have young queer kids in my life, in my family, and I learn so much from them every day. They're so much more intersectional. They're so much smarter and more evolved about thinking about gender. And, there's going to be new language that we don't even understand right now. I don't know whether the milestone will be that we have third gender options on our passports across most of the world, or what it'll actually look like, because we're not there yet. But the next generation can see it, and I think really empowering and listening to them, and both, yes, we can be wise elders, but we also have to empower this next generation, which has taken us forward, and I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the attendees for all the comments and the questions. And thank you, all of you, Ian, Stephen, Natasha, Julie. And I think this was